What if everything you believe is just a well-told lie? Truth, that word we use every day, might actually be one of the greatest illusions in human history. Plato said we only see shadows on the wall of a cave. Nietzsche called truth an illusion we've forgotten is an illusion. And the Buddha went even further, saying that only those who face suffering can truly touch the truth. Today, we live in an age of post-truth, fake news, algorithms, and realities filtered through screens. Yet one question never goes away. Does something we can truly call truth even exist? In this video, we'll travel through over 2,000 years of thought, from ancient Greece to Eastern masters, from psychoanalysis to artificial intelligence, to explore every argument about truth, what it is, where it might be found, and whether it exists at all. For Plato, truth isn't found in what we see, touch, or feel. The real truth lies beyond the physical world. What we call reality is, for him, just a shadow, an imperfect reflection of something much deeper and eternal, the world of ideas. Imagine this: everything you've ever seen, a tree, a triangle, an act of courage, or a moment of justice, is only an imperfect copy of a perfect, unchanging form that exists on another plane, invisible to the eyes but accessible through reason. This idea appears clearly in his famous allegory of the cave, from the Republic. In it, Plato describes prisoners chained inside a cave since birth, able to see only shadows projected on a wall. For them, those shadows are all that exists. But when one of them escapes and steps outside, he sees the sun, the real world, and realizes that what he once called truth was only an illusion. That's exactly what Plato suggests. Our minds, limited by the senses, live trapped in the world of appearances. Truth exists outside the cave, beyond what seems real, and we can only reach it through the effort of reason. According to Plato, the human soul has already seen the world of ideas before being born. That's why learning is really remembering. He called this process anamnesis, the soul's act of recalling what is eternal. For example, when we recognize what justice is, even though we've never seen perfect justice, it's because our soul has already contemplated it. The same goes for goodness, beauty, courage, or even mathematics. The truth of these things doesn't depend on the physical world. They are eternal, universal, and accessible only through philosophical reasoning. This view carries powerful implications. Plato isn't just saying that truth is invisible. He's saying that living only by the senses means living in illusion. For him, philosophy is the soul's path toward freedom from shadows. True education, therefore, isn't about transmitting information, but about awakening the soul's desire to remember truth. This idea shaped the entire Western philosophical tradition. Without Plato, we wouldn't have the distinction between appearance and essence that influenced thinkers like Augustine, Descartes, Kant, and Heidegger. More than that, his notion of a reality beyond the visible inspired religions, schools of thought, and theories about the nature of existence itself. Plato's lesson is profound. Truth doesn't reveal itself to the eyes. It reveals itself to the soul that seeks it with courage and reason. Truth isn't something given, it's something earned. And to find it, we must leave the cave, face the light, and remember who we truly are. Facing the complexity of the world and the diversity of opinions, Aristotle proposed something revolutionary in its simplicity. Truth happens when we say that something is, and that thing really is. In other words, truth exists when what we say matches what actually exists. This clear and precise idea became the foundation of a philosophical and scientific tradition that lasted for millennia. In his work Metaphysics, Aristotle defines it this way: to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is to speak the truth. This marks the birth of the idea of truth as a correspondence between thought and reality. And although it sounds obvious, it has deep implications. For Aristotle, humans have the ability to form judgments, to combine ideas and say something about the world. These judgments can be true or false, depending on how well they match the facts of reality. Aristotle broke away from Plato's idea that truth could only be found in an ideal realm. He taught that truth exists in concrete things, in the beings that exist, in the facts of the world, and that the human mind, through language and logic, can understand this reality. It's a radical trust in reason, but a reason directed toward the real world, not the transcendent. This thinking didn't arise in isolation. Aristotle built a rigorous logical system that would become the backbone of rational argumentation for centuries. His Organon, a collection of works on logic, established principles such as the law of non-contradiction, it is impossible for something to be and not be at the same time, and the law of the excluded middle, either it is or it is not. These foundations allowed truth to be investigated clearly, methodically, and consistently. Aristotle's proposal strongly echoes in modern science. When a scientist creates a hypothesis, they are essentially testing whether a statement corresponds to observable reality. The empirical method, observing, experimenting, testing, is based on the belief that there's an external world and that our ideas must match it in order to be considered true. That's Aristotle's legacy living in how we think even today. But there's something deeper in his thought. The idea that knowing the truth is, in a way, organizing the world, discovering its causes, its principles, its whys. For Aristotle, every human naturally desires to know. Seeking truth, therefore, is an essential expression of who we are. He didn't see truth as a prize reserved for philosophers, but as something anyone can access through reason, anyone willing to observe carefully and think clearly. Truth isn't a distant revelation, but an alignment between the mind and the world. In the eyes of Immanuel Kant, the search for truth doesn't begin with the external world, but with a more radical question. How is it possible to know anything at all? Before asking whether a statement is true, Kant forces us to investigate the conditions that make knowledge possible. And this is where his philosophy marks a real revolution. Kant doesn't deny that an external reality exists, what he calls the thing in itself, or noumenon. But he argues that we can never access it directly. Everything we know is made up of phenomena, meaning the way reality appears to us after passing through fundamental filters, space, time, and the categories of understanding. These filters don't come from the world, they come from us. For Kant, we don't just receive information from reality, we automatically organize it. Space and time aren't things that exist outside of us. They're forms of our perception. Likewise, categories such as causality, unity, and substance are internal structures of our thought. Without them, no experience would make sense at all. That's why Kant called his philosophy transcendental idealism. Idealism because what we know is shaped by the structures of the mind, and transcendental because he seeks to uncover the elements that make knowledge possible, without falling into pure subjectivism. In this context, truth can't simply be a correspondence between an idea and the external world, as Aristotle believed. For Kant, truth is conditioned by the cognitive structures of the subject. In other words, it's valid within the realm of possible experience, but can't go beyond the limits of reason. That's why Kant distinguishes between analytic judgments, which only unpack what's already contained in the concept, like all bachelors are unmarried, and synthetic a priori judgments, true advances in knowledge. These are statements that expand our understanding, but don't depend on direct experience, like the laws of mathematics or the basic principles of physics. They're possible precisely because our mind already structures experience through these categories. This distinction allows science to work, but it also sets clear limits for metaphysics. Questions such as the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, or absolute freedom can't be proven or disproven by theoretical reason, because they go beyond the limits of possible experience. However, Kant doesn't close the door on truth. He simply moves the question. Truth must be sought within the boundaries of human reason, not beyond them. His project doesn't destroy knowledge. it grounds it with precision and depth. Ultimately, Kant teaches us intellectual humility. He reminds us that we don't know the world as it truly is, but only as it appears to us, and that awareness isn't a weakness, it's a sign of maturity. Recognizing the limits of knowledge is the first step toward using it with responsibility and freedom. In the middle of chaos, fragile beliefs, and centuries of accumulated errors, René Descartes asked a radical question: what can I truly trust? He wasn't looking for just any kind of certainty. He was searching for a truth so firm that it could withstand all doubt, a solid rock on which all knowledge could be built. From that search came one of the most famous phrases in the history of philosophy: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But to understand the weight of that statement, we need to look at the path that led him there. Descartes decided to doubt everything: the information from the senses, religious beliefs, and even the scientific truths of his time. What if everything was just a dream? What if an evil genius was deceiving his mind at every moment? Not even the most obvious things escaped his methodical doubt. However, in the middle of this radical process of tearing down certainties, something remained unshakable: the very act of doubting. Even if all ideas were false, there was still someone thinking, someone doubting. And that simple fact made it impossible to deny one's own existence as a thinking being. If I'm doubting, then I exist. This is the foundation of Cartesian thought, an absolutely undeniable truth found not outside of us, but within our own consciousness. The I think becomes the starting point for everything else. From that certainty, Descartes tries to rebuild the entire structure of knowledge brick by brick, based on clear and distinct truths. This marks the birth of modern rationalism. Instead of trusting the senses, which can deceive us, Descartes places his trust in pure reason, in the clarity of thought. True knowledge must be evident, logical, and orderly, like a mathematical proof. For him, only reason can give us access to truth. The cogito isn't just a statement of existence, it's a revolution. It puts the individual at the center of philosophy, introduces the idea of an internal foundation of knowledge, and profoundly influences how we think about science, subjectivity, and even identity. Truth, from this point on, doesn't depend on the external world, but on the inner structure of the conscious mind. However, Descartes didn't stop there. After establishing the certainty of the thinking self, he tried to prove the existence of God and the external world based on that secure reasoning. Even though many have questioned those later proofs, the legacy of the cogito remains untouched. Truth begins where doubt can no longer exist. Today, when we question what's real in a world of digital appearances, deep fakes, and post-truth, Descartes' proposal feels more urgent than ever. We need to find a point of firmness in the middle of uncertainty. And maybe, like Descartes, that point lies within, in the act of thinking, in the effort to question, and in the courage to start from zero to find what's truly real. When we talk about truth, we usually think of it as something that matches reality, as if all we had to do was compare a statement to a fact in the world. But for Martin Heidegger, that way of thinking had already been corrupted by centuries of distance from the real philosophical question: being. Heidegger wasn't just looking for a new definition of truth. He wanted to go back to the root of Western thought. To do that, he revived an ancient Greek word that had been forgotten: aletheia. This word, usually translated as truth, literally means unveiling or unconcealment. For him, truth isn't about correspondence between mind and world. It's about how being reveals itself to us, how it comes into view for human existence. In his most influential work, Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger argues that before any statement can be judged as true or false, something must first show itself, appear, come into presence. This means that the most fundamental aspect of truth isn't logic, but the act of revealing. The world isn't just out there, ready to be described. It reveals itself gradually through contexts, relationships, and lived experiences, and that's where the human role becomes essential. For Heidegger, we aren't just individuals in the world. He uses the term Dasein, which literally means being there, to describe the human being as the one who is aware of being, who lives in the world openly. Dasein is the being for whom being matters, the one who asks the question of existence, who lives through time, language, and the awareness of death. That's why we are, in Heidegger's words, the shepherds of being. But this task isn't simple. Heidegger says that truth often hides itself at the same time that it reveals itself. When we focus on one aspect of reality, others fade into the background. There's always a shadow in everything that appears. Because of that, truth is never total, final, or absolute. It's a process, an opening, a clearing that forms in the dense forest of being. This view completely changes how we relate to truth. It's no longer about collecting objective data or reaching rational certainties. It's about living authentically, paying attention to how being shows itself in our daily experiences, in work, love, art, and even anxiety. Truth reveals itself in concrete existence, not in textbooks or ready-made formulas. Heidegger doesn't give us a closed definition of truth, and he doesn't want to. What he offers is an invitation to ask again what it means to be true and to listen to what being itself has to say without forcing it into our pre-made systems. In this sense, truth is always an event, always a play of light and shadow, always something larger than words can contain. Friedrich Nietzsche was never satisfied with easy answers, especially when it came to the idea of truth. For him, this concept so glorified by Western philosophy was actually a human invention, not a pure reflection of reality, but a creation, fragile, self-serving, and often convenient. In his essay on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, Nietzsche says that truth is a useful illusion, a collection of worn-out metaphors that, over time, we've forgotten were metaphors in the first place. When we create concepts and words to describe the world, we're translating a living, chaotic reality into fixed structures. But those structures don't capture reality itself. They simplify it, tame it, and freeze what's always in motion. So truth isn't discovered. It's built, imposed, and repeated until it becomes habit. And that's exactly where Nietzsche challenges centuries of philosophy that sought universal, unchanging, and rational truths. He provokes us by saying there are no facts, only interpretations. What we call a fact is simply what a culture has agreed to treat as truth. This view is deeply unsettling. If there's no absolute truth, does that mean everything is relative? Nietzsche wouldn't put it that way. What he suggests is more subtle and more challenging. Truth is always tied to power relations, human needs, and vital impulses. It's a creation of will, not a neutral reflection of reality. That's why, throughout history, different truths have been upheld, often to preserve specific social or religious orders. Nietzsche's critique especially targets Christian morality and the Platonic ideal, which he saw as ways of denying life, of seeking truths beyond the physical world, as if reality itself weren't good enough. He calls this passive nihilism, the rejection of real life in favor of transcendent values. His alternative is the opposite, a yes to life, even in its impermanence, uncertainty, and pain. Truth, then, is no longer an end in itself. It becomes a tool, and also a weapon. Whoever controls the narrative of truth controls behavior, morality, and culture. This idea powerfully anticipates later thinkers like Foucault, who expanded on the concept that truth is always connected to power. Nietzsche isn't telling us to stop searching for truth altogether. What he wants is for us to recognize our own role in creating meaning, to stop living like the last men, tired, complacent, and conformist, and to live as creators of value, as individuals capable of affirming life with authenticity. For Nietzsche, the deepest truth isn't something outside of us. It's something we create from the life we choose to live. Courage isn't about discovering absolute truth, but about living without it, and still giving the world meaning. Michel Foucault forces us to rethink everything we consider true. Instead of asking what is truth, he asks who is saying this is true, and more importantly, what power structures make this truth possible. In his work, truth is no longer something pure, universal, or neutral. It becomes a historical product, shaped by social, political, and institutional forces. Foucault breaks with the idea that truth is out there waiting to be discovered. For him, what a society considers true at any given time, what is taught, normalized, or respected, comes from a regime of truth, a network of discourses legitimized by institutions like schools, churches, courts, hospitals, and the media. This idea appears strongly in works like Discipline and Punish and The Order of Discourse. Foucault shows that all knowledge is tied to power, and that power doesn't just operate through force, but mainly through knowledge itself. Power and knowledge are intertwined. Whoever has the power to define what is true also defines what is normal, acceptable, and legitimate, and what must be silenced, excluded, or punished. For example, when analyzing the rise of psychiatry, Foucault doesn't ask whether madness is real or not. Instead, he investigates how the figure of the madman was historically constructed, who decided what was normal, and how medicine began to exercise control over behavior. The same applies to the concepts of criminal, patient, or sexuality. Truth is built within social practices that discipline and control bodies. What's most disturbing is that these truthful discourses aren't forced on us. We internalize them. We begin to watch ourselves, compare ourselves to standards, and believe we're acting freely, when in fact we're being shaped by invisible norms. Foucault calls this biopower, a form of power that doesn't openly repress, but instead produces identities, behaviors, and ways of living. But Foucault isn't saying that everything is a lie. What he's saying is far more subtle and powerful. The truths of any era are social constructions, and that's why they must be critically examined. What we consider true today might, in the future, be seen as a disguised form of oppression. Think about how, not so long ago, people believed that women were inferior, that some races were superior, or that homosexuality was a disease. All of that was once considered scientific truth, and all of it fell because of criticism. That's the liberating power of Foucault's thought. He doesn't offer a new truth for us to believe in. He teaches us to question ready-made ones, to challenge dominant discourses, and to ask who benefits from them. In a time of polarization, manipulation, and information overload, Foucault invites us to think critically and courageously. What truths are we accepting today that future generations will look back on and ask, how did we not see it before? 8. Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. While many philosophers searched for truth through abstract concepts or universal theories, the Buddha took a different path, one of direct experience and inner liberation. For him, truth wasn't an idea to be debated, but a reality to be lived and understood through one's own existence. This isn't a theoretical kind of knowledge. It's an existential one, focused on human suffering and the real possibility of overcoming it. The Four Noble Truths, presented by the Buddha right after his enlightenment, form the heart of his teaching and the starting point of any spiritual path in Buddhism. They are: 1. The truth of suffering, dukkha. Life, at its core, is marked by dissatisfaction. We suffer from physical and emotional pain, from loss, from impermanence, and even from the very things that seem to bring us pleasure. Recognizing suffering isn't pessimism. It's radical honesty about the human condition. 2. The truth of the origin of suffering. Suffering has a cause, and that cause is attachment, craving, the endless thirst to control life, to avoid the inevitable, and to hold on to what is temporary. We desire what we don't have and fear losing what we do. The more we try to control things, the more we suffer. This cause isn't metaphysical, it's found in our own mental and emotional patterns. 3. The truth of the cessation of suffering. Here comes the liberating message: suffering can end. We are not condemned to live trapped in the cycle of desire and frustration. When we deeply understand the impermanence of all things and let go of our attachments, freedom arises. This state of liberation is called nirvana, not a mystical paradise, but the extinction of suffering and ignorance. 4. The truth of the path, leading to the end of suffering. The Buddha didn't just point out the problem, he offered a path. The Noble Eightfold Path is a practice that integrates wisdom, ethics, and meditation. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. It's not a belief to accept, but a discipline to practice. These truths are not dogmas. The Buddha never asked for blind faith. On the contrary, he encouraged questioning and direct experience. He said, "Do not believe something just because it's been said. Test it for yourself and see if it's true." Buddhist teaching, therefore, redefines what it means to know the truth. It's not about knowing more. It's about seeing more clearly. For the Buddha, truth is the awakening of consciousness, seeing things as they really are, free from distortions, illusions, and the filters of the ego. In a fast-paced world full of distractions, the Four Noble Truths remind us that wisdom begins with the courage to look inward. And the most transformative truth isn't the one that explains the universe. It's the one that frees the heart from suffering. 9. Wittgenstein, First Phase. Truth as Logical Tautology. In his first major philosophical work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, Ludwig Wittgenstein proposed a radically new way of thinking about truth. For him, the essence of true thought doesn't lie in random ideas, but in the logical structure of language. And language itself only makes sense when it accurately reflects the structure of the world. Wittgenstein starts from a strict view. The world is made up of facts, not things. These facts are configurations of objects connected in specific ways. When used correctly, language paints a picture of these facts. It represents reality through propositions that mirror its logical form. In this sense, truth happens when a proposition corresponds to the fact in the world that it refers to. For example, the statement, "snow is white," is true if and only if snow in the real world is actually white. If it's not, then the statement is false. That sounds simple, but Wittgenstein's depth lies in his precision. Every meaningful proposition is an attempt to mirror reality, and language only has meaning when it can do so logically. But Wittgenstein goes further. He shows that pure logic says nothing about the world itself. Logical propositions, like "if A, then A," are tautologies, meaning empty truths that hold only because of their form. They don't reveal anything new, but serve as frameworks that organize thought. For him, logic isn't a science of the world. It's the structure that makes any talk about the world possible. That's why, at the famous end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein writes, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent." It's one of the most powerful sentences in 20th century philosophy. With it, he draws a limit. Language only makes sense when it can logically represent a state of affairs in the world. Anything beyond that, such as ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, or even the meaning of life, can't be expressed meaningfully in logical language. Not because these things are unimportant, but because they lie beyond what language can capture. This doesn't mean Wittgenstein dismissed those subjects, far from it. He acknowledged their value, but believed that some things are simply too profound to be said. They can only be shown, lived, or felt. This first phase of his thought had a huge impact on analytic philosophy, influencing fields like logic, semantics, and language theory. He offered a rigorous and elegant vision of how language can capture truth, but also warned us of its limits. Wittgenstein reminds us that not every truth fits into words. There's a silent boundary between what we can clearly say and what only silence can hold. At a time when reason and faith seemed to belong to different worlds, Thomas Aquinas built one of the greatest syntheses in the history of thought, the idea that human truth is a participation in divine truth. For him, truth is not only a correspondence between thought and reality, it is, above all, an expression of the divine order that sustains the universe. Aquinas lived in the 13th century, during the height of scholasticism, when Christianity was trying to integrate the Greek and Roman philosophical heritage, especially Aristotle, into Christian theology. His intellectual project was bold, to show that human reason, when properly used, doesn't conflict with faith, but actually strengthens it. At the center of his vision lies a precise definition. Truth is the conformity of the intellect to reality. Veritas est adequatio intellectus et re. However, this reality for Aquinas isn't self-sufficient. It exists because it participates in God's being. And here is where his definition of truth gains a spiritual dimension. The highest truth exists in the mind of God, who is truth itself, eternal, unchanging, and perfect. We, as human beings, don't create truth. We discover it, as our reason aligns with the divine order. But while human reason is valid and capable of reaching many natural truths, as in science, ethics, and logic, it must be illuminated by faith to reach supernatural truths, such as the existence of God, the incarnation of Christ, or eternal life. In his masterpiece Summa Theologica, Aquinas explains that there are two types of truths. 1. Truths accessible through natural reason. For example, that God exists, that the world is ordered, or that everything has a purpose. 2. Truths revealed through faith, such as the mysteries of the Trinity, grace, and resurrection. These truths do not contradict each other. On the contrary, faith and reason come from the same Creator and therefore exist in harmony. When properly understood, faith purifies reason from its errors, and reason helps faith avoid fanaticism and superstition. Truth, then, is not just a logical or rational issue, it's a spiritual journey. Seeking truth means drawing closer to God. And more than that, living in truth means living justly, orderly, and oriented toward goodness. Truth isn't just something we know, it's something we live. Thomas Aquinas teaches that the human mind reflects, even if imperfectly, the light of the divine intellect. To know, therefore, is to participate in God's being. And in this act of understanding the world with reverence and clarity, reason and faith meet, not as rivals, but as allies in the search for what is truly real. For Confucius, the Chinese thinker of the 6th century BCE, truth wasn't found in abstract metaphysical ideas or universal concepts like in Western philosophy. It lived in the practical harmony between words, actions, and social roles. In his view, the world falls into disorder when words stop matching actions, when what we claim to be doesn't align with who we really are. From this comes one of his most important principles, the rectification of names, Zhengming. In Confucian tradition, names represent the moral roles and responsibilities a person takes on in society, being a father, son, ruler, minister, citizen, teacher, or student. These names aren't just labels, they carry ethical duties, expected virtues, and proper forms of conduct. For Confucius, truth means living consistently with the name one carries. He said, "If the name is not correct, speech will not be in accordance with the truth of things. If speech is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried out successfully." This simple yet profound idea reveals a moral and relational concept of truth. A father, to be true, must act with care, responsibility, and example. A ruler, to be true, must govern with justice, integrity, and benevolence. A wise person must cultivate virtue and guide others with wisdom. When words and roles become distorted, social and moral order collapse. In a time of political instability and constant wars in ancient China, Confucius saw the crisis not only as a failure of government, but as a corruption of names, a loss of moral identity. Rulers behaved like tyrants, sons disrespected their fathers, ministers sought power instead of service. The outer chaos reflected an inner lie, a separation from the ethical truth that sustains society. Unlike the Western idea of truth as a correspondence between thought and reality, truth for Confucius is an act of moral integrity. It's not enough to speak correctly. One must act according to who they are and be according to what they say. Words must be lived, not just spoken. That's why the path to wisdom in Confucianism involves cultivating virtues such as ren, humanity, lai, ritual and propriety, wai, justice, and zhi, wisdom. This view carries tremendous practical power. It calls for consistency between identity and action, especially in a world where words are often empty or manipulative. In times of incoherent speeches, false political promises, broken families, and neglected responsibilities, Confucius's message remains urgent. Truth lives in just action, in honoring relationships, and in living up to the names we carry. Confucius invites us to a quiet but powerful kind of truth, the truth of living with dignity in what we are. And in that ethical effort, both personal and collective, lies the possibility of restoring harmony to the world. For Carl Gustav Jung, one of the great figures of 20th century depth psychology, truth isn't an objective concept to be discovered outside of us, like a formula or a scientific theory. On the contrary, the most essential truth is subjective, intimate, and born from an honest confrontation with one's own unconscious. To know the truth, in this sense, is to know yourself, and that takes far more than gathering information. It takes courage. Jung developed the concept of individuation, a deep and ongoing psychological process in which a person integrates all parts of their psyche to become who they truly are. Truth, then, isn't a fixed point, but a path of inner transformation. And this path necessarily passes through three major aspects of the psyche: the persona, the shadow, and the self. The persona is the social mask we wear, the role we play in the world to be accepted, understood, and recognized. It isn't necessarily false, but it's incomplete. It's the version of ourselves we show to the outside world, shaped by social, cultural, and family expectations. Yet the more we identify with that mask, the further we move from our inner wholeness. On the other side lies the shadow. Everything within us that has been repressed, denied, or deemed unacceptable. Anger, fear, desire, jealousy, but also forgotten talents and creative impulses. The shadow isn't only the dark side, it's everything that doesn't fit into the ideal image we have of ourselves. And Jung was clear about this. Finding truth requires facing the shadow, recognizing it, accepting it, and learning from it. Finally, there is the self, the deepest and most complete center of the psyche, the symbol of totality and integration. The self isn't the ideal ego, but the harmonious union of conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, reason and instinct. It's what we are meant to become, not an external model to follow, but an inner truth already living within us, waiting to be awakened. The process of individuation is neither linear nor easy. It involves crises, ruptures, symbols, dreams, losses, and rebirths. But it's through this inner journey that truth emerges, not as a logical certainty, but as existential authenticity. Jung doesn't invite us to discover truth as something external, but to live it as a full expression of who we truly are, with all our contradictions. In an age of superficiality, constant comparison, and fragile identities, Jung's message brings us back to what really matters. Truth means being whole, even if that makes us different, lonely, or misunderstood. To truly know yourself is a revolutionary and sacred act. As Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And to awaken, in this sense, is to touch a truth that no language can define, but one that transforms your entire existence. Not all truths are temporary. Some truths don't depend on culture, historical time, or public opinion. Some truths simply are eternal, necessary, and universal. It's on this solid ground that Spinoza builds his philosophy, the search for an understanding that goes beyond appearances and emotional confusion, reaching reality as it truly is, in its eternal essence. For him, this reality is called God or nature, two words for the same infinite substance that expresses itself through everything that exists. Spinoza broke away from the traditional view of a personal God, a creator separate from the world. Instead, he claimed that God is the very being of all things, and that everything that exists is a modification of this divine substance. Nothing exists outside of God. Therefore, to know reality clearly is also to know God. But such knowledge doesn't come easily. Most of the time, we're guided by confused, partial ideas born from emotions and sensory impressions. Anger, envy, fear, jealousy. These feelings trap us in a fragmented perception of reality. Spinoza called this active ignorance. It's not just not knowing, but living under the power of forces we don't understand. Truth, in this sense, is a form of liberation. Freeing ourselves from the control of passions doesn't mean denying them. It means understanding them. For Spinoza, the more we understand an emotion, the less it dominates us, and the more it becomes a source of strength. And this clarity comes through reason, not a cold or distant reason, but one deeply connected to life. When guided by reason, the mind can form adequate ideas that express the necessary order of things. By understanding the real causes behind events and seeing how everything is interconnected, the mind rises above confusion. And at that point, one can begin to live from the perspective of eternity. To live sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, doesn't mean escaping time, but seeing time differently. It means understanding that every being, every event, every emotion has its necessary place in the grand web of existence. Nothing happens by chance. Nothing stands alone. This vision doesn't erase suffering, but it transforms the way we relate to it. For Spinoza, true blessedness, lasting happiness, doesn't come from momentary pleasure, but from the joy that arises through understanding. Joy, in this sense, is a sign that we're getting closer to our true essence, to our union with divine nature. To know the truth, then, isn't about collecting information. It's about reaching a clear, rational, and loving vision of reality as a whole. And in that understanding, Spinoza says we find freedom, peace, and fulfillment. Not every truth can be spoken, and not every silence is empty. Nagarjuna, one of the greatest philosophers of Mahayana Buddhism, takes us into a realm where words stumble, concepts fail, and thought itself bends before paradox. For him, ultimate truth isn't something that can be affirmed or denied. It is emptiness, shunyata, not as nothingness, but as the realization that all appearances and dualities are illusions. Nagarjuna's philosophy, presented in his work Mula-madhyamaka-karika, Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, delivers a profound challenge to conceptual attachment. He starts from a radical insight. Nothing exists independently or permanently. Everything is interdependent, conditioned, and empty of its own essence. Things don't possess being in themselves. They only arise in relation. And it is precisely this lack of fixed essence, this emptiness, that defines ultimate reality. However, this truth can't be captured by dualistic language. Nagarjuna shows that any attempt to say this is or this is not already falls into conceptual error. Language works through opposites, being or non-being, real or unreal, absolute or relative. But emptiness escapes all these categories. It's not something, but it's not nothing either. It's the clearing away of all extremes, the middle way that goes beyond illusionary opposites. Here, the distinction between two levels of truth becomes essential. conventional truth, the one we use in daily life, in relationships, in language. Ultimate truth, the one that exists beyond all mental constructions. Nagarjuna doesn't reject conventional truth. He simply shows its limits. It's useful and functional, but not final. Most people cling to concepts as if they were perfect mirrors of reality, when in fact they are just temporary tools, ladders to be climbed and then left behind. Ultimate truth, on the other hand, cannot be expressed. It can only be realized, lived, awakened to. And what happens when we truly understand emptiness? Contrary to what many think, it doesn't lead to nihilism. It leads to compassion and wisdom. When we see that all things are interdependent and empty of separate essence, attachment fades. The solid sense of I dissolves, and the rigid separation between self and other disappears. What arises instead is a deep openness to reality as it is, impermanent, fluid, without a fixed center. In that silent recognition, freedom blossoms. Nagarjuna's teaching is profoundly liberating. He doesn't offer new truths to believe in, but a patient dismantling of all false foundations of knowledge. His philosophy isn't a doctrine. It's a practice of letting go, an invitation to release certainty and dwell in mystery. Like a clear mirror, emptiness reflects all things without clinging to any of them. And perhaps, paradoxically, the deepest truth is the one that doesn't need to be spoken, because it is already present in everything, silently. In an age marked by polarization, misinformation, and battles over narratives, Jürgen Habermas's proposal feels like a breath of rational and ethical air. Truth isn't imposed or relative. It emerges from dialogue. For this major thinker of contemporary philosophy, truth must be built collectively, through a process of free communication where arguments, not power, lead to understanding. Habermas is part of the Frankfurt School tradition, but he took his own path by trying to reclaim reason as a tool for emancipation, not domination. In his extensive work, especially in the theory of communicative action, he develops a view of language that goes far beyond simply transmitting information. For him, language is, above all, a space for mutual understanding between people. Within this idea, he introduces the concept of the ideal speech situation. It's a theoretical condition where everyone in a dialogue has an equal chance to speak, is free to question any claim, is not under pressure, fear, or manipulation, and sincerely seeks mutual understanding. It's within this kind of environment, Habermas says, that truth can emerge as a rational consensus. This doesn't mean that truth depends on majority opinion or temporary agreement. Rather, it means that the validity of a statement is tested and recognized through open, free, and ethical argumentation. This idea is Habermas's response to the skepticism and relativism that took over much of postmodern philosophy. For many, if all truths are social constructions, then everything is relative. Habermas doesn't deny that truth has a social context, but he insists that there is still a rational and communicative criterion for distinguishing what's valid. Truth, in this sense, is whatever would hold up under critical examination by everyone involved in an undistorted dialogue. This is also why his thinking has a strong ethical and political dimension. He believes that democratic societies should be organized around this ideal of communication. It's not enough to guarantee freedom of speech. People must also have real spaces for dialogue where they can be heard and take part in shaping the norms that affect them. Truth, therefore, is deeply connected to justice, citizenship, and human dignity. Habermas reminds us that language isn't just a tool to describe the world. It's a way to build relationships. And those relationships can only be genuine when they're based on respect, listening, and reasoned discussion. In a world where shouting and manipulation often dominate the public sphere, his philosophy feels like a call for collective maturity. We must relearn how to talk honestly. For him, truth isn't the property of an intellectual elite, nor the result of ideological force. It's born when human beings meet as equals, with openness, reason, and the will to understand. In that sense, the search for truth is also an exercise in humanity. Not every truth can be named. Not every kind of knowledge can be explained. For Laozi, the legendary Chinese sage and author of the classic Tao Te Ching, the highest truth isn't something defined by words. It's something felt and lived with one's whole being. The Tao, the way, is the ultimate eternal reality, but it's also beyond description. Right in the opening line of his book, Laozi warns us, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. For Ford, this sentence lays the foundation for a philosophy that challenges conceptual and rational thinking. The Tao can't be captured by definitions, formulas, or doctrines. Any attempt to describe it already limits it. The Tao isn't a thing among other things, nor a separate entity. It's the essential flow of existence, the natural order of life, the silent wisdom that moves everything effortlessly. Laozi invites us to shift our focus. Instead of trying to control truth, we should learn to flow with it. Whoever tries to grasp it loses it, but the one who empties themselves of certainties, quiets the mind, and listens with the heart can live in harmony with the Tao, even without being able to describe it. This is a kind of wisdom very different from the Western tradition, which often connects truth with logical clarity, rational structure, and objectivity. Laozi offers another path, truth as spontaneity, softness, and naturalness. He teaches that the wise person is like water, humble, adaptable, patient, and precisely for that reason, invincible. To live according to the Tao, one must cultivate Wu Wei, action without force, or non-action, in the sense of not interfering with the natural order of things. This doesn't mean passivity or indifference, but acting lightly, without resistance, ego, or control. It means allowing action to arise from inner stillness, not from the desire to dominate. Laozi also warns against too many words, laws, and rules. The more humans try to impose order through artificial means, the further they drift from true harmony. Truth isn't found in human systems, but in the simplicity of nature, in the rhythm of day and night, the growth of a tree, the quiet of emptiness. To live the Tao is to return to what's essential, to detachment, simplicity, and inner peace. It's realizing that the universe has its own wisdom and that we are part of it, not its masters. This philosophy, both gentle and radical, still echoes strongly in the modern world. In times of information overload, constant noise, and competing voices, Laozi calls us back to silence, observation, and deep listening. Because sometimes, the highest truth isn't the one that can be explained. It's the one that can be lived. And the true sage isn't the one who proclaims truth, but the one who becomes the way itself. 17. Rorty, truth as pragmatic solidarity. For Richard Rorty, the search for an absolute, eternal, and objective truth isn't just an illusion. It's unnecessary. Instead of trying to find a perfect match between language and reality, Rorty suggests a radical shift in focus. Truth isn't a discovery about the world, but a useful construction created by communities that share common practices, values, and hopes. In other words, truth is a matter of solidarity, not a mirror of reality. Influenced by the American pragmatists William James and John Dewey, Rorty rejects the idea that there's a fixed nature of things waiting to be revealed through pure reason. According to him, there's no special method that gives us privileged access to reality. What we actually have are languages, vocabularies, and ways of speaking that we use to make sense of the world, and we choose the ones that work best for us as a community. In his most famous work, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, 1979, Rorty dismantles the philosophical tradition that treated the mind as a mirror capable of perfectly reflecting reality. For him, that metaphor created an obsession with certainty and distanced philosophy from real life. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" he suggests we ask, "Is this useful? Does this improve dialogue? Does this promote justice and freedom?" From this comes his idea of pragmatic solidarity. In this view, truth isn't something out there, separate from us, but what emerges through social conversation as valid, coherent, and meaningful. Not because of some external authority, but because it resonates with the shared values of a community striving to live better together. This approach doesn't deny the importance of truth, it simply redefines it. For Rorty, seeking truth means taking part in a collective effort to build a more livable world. It's about creating working agreements that foster understanding, empathy, and freedom. Science, for example, is valuable not because it reveals an ultimate reality, but because it produces useful, reliable results that help us navigate life more effectively. It's important to note that Rorty wasn't a nihilistic relativist. He didn't believe anything goes. What he argued is that our standards of truth are born from public conversation, and they can and should be questioned, refined, and improved as new situations and problems arise. Instead of searching for a fixed, universal point to justify our beliefs, Rorty invites us to build bridges between people, based on mutual understanding and concern for the common good. In this sense, truth isn't a mirror, it's a social and moral tool. His proposal is especially relevant in today's world, where absolute certainties often fuel dogmatism. Rorty reminds us that the most important kind of truth might be the one we create together, through respect, freedom, and solidarity. 18. Parmenides, truth as being, unchanging, and one long before. Plato, Aristotle, or any modern philosopher, Parmenides of Elea made one of the most radical statements in the history of thought. What is, and what is not, is not. This seemingly simple phrase became the cornerstone of a worldview that broke away from trust in the senses and gave birth to Western metaphysics. For Parmenides, truth is not found in everyday experience or in the world of appearances. The world we perceive, where things are born, change, transform, and die, is pure illusion. Multiplicity, movement, change, all of that, he said, cannot be the object of true knowledge because it involves what he called non-being. And to speak of non-being for Parmenides is both a logical and ontological error. His philosophical poem, known as On Nature, tells an allegorical journey in which the thinker is guided by a goddess to choose between two paths: the path of opinion, doxa, based on sensory perceptions and human beliefs, which leads to error; the path of truth, aletheia, which follows being, eternal, unchanging, one, complete, and rational. Parmenides declares firmly, "You will never find non-being, for it is impossible to grasp. Therefore, the only thing that truly exists, being, cannot have arisen, cannot change, and cannot cease to be. It simply is. It always was and always will be. And more than that, it is one. There is no multiplicity, no division, no void." This idea forces us to question our most basic certainties. Everything we see changing, seasons, bodies, emotions, cannot, for Parmenides, be the object of true knowledge. The senses deceive us. Only reason, purified of contradictions, can reach the truth. This extreme position deeply influenced the birth of philosophy itself. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all responded to Parmenides, trying to reconcile the experience of change with the demand for logical truth. Plato, for example, took inspiration from Parmenides to develop his theory of eternal ideas, a way to preserve the stability of being amid the shifting world of the senses. The greatness of Parmenides lies in his radical courage. He didn't bow to the evidence of the senses. He demanded absolute coherence from thought. And by doing so, he laid the foundation for the rational method that would define all of Western philosophy. In times of relativism, shifting truths, and fleeting perceptions, his voice still echoes like an anchor. Truth does not change. Truth simply is. For Parmenides, to know is to think being, and to think being is to turn away from illusion. True thinking aligns with what endures, with what is one, complete, and necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. For Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, Truth doesn't appear to the conscious mind clearly or directly. On the contrary, the essential truth about a person is hidden, repressed, disguised. It lives in the unconscious and doesn't reveal itself through reason, but returns in unexpected ways, through dreams, slips of the tongue, symptoms, and neuroses. Freud broke away from the long-held belief that humans are transparent to themselves. He showed that within us exist forces we don't control, desires we deny, and memories we hide, even from ourselves. Yet those forces never really disappear. What is repressed, he said, always returns. But it doesn't come back as it once was. The truth of the unconscious shows itself indirectly, in fragments, symbols, and distortions. One of the central ideas of psychoanalysis is that psychological symptoms have meaning. They aren't random errors or senseless disorders. They're coded messages from the unconscious, compromises between a repressed desire and the censorship of the ego. To interpret a symptom, then, is to decode it like a riddle, and in that process, the repressed truth gradually reveals itself through speaking, remembering, and freely associating. Freud once said, "Wo es war, soll ich werden." This is usually translated as, "Where the id was, the ego shall be." It sums up his therapeutic goal to help a person take ownership of their inner truth by bringing the unconscious into consciousness. That doesn't mean everything must be rationalized. It means the person learns to face their story, their conflicts, and their desires without denying their complexity. It's important to understand that, for Freud, a person's truth isn't a fixed essence, but a construction shaped by language, repression, desire, and personal history. The unconscious isn't a vault of absolute truths. It's a dynamic space where truth disguises itself to survive internal censorship. This idea of truth as the return of the repressed also challenges the notion of a sovereign self. What we think we are, our conscious ego, is only the tip of the iceberg. Most of our mental life happens outside our control, yet it deeply influences what we feel, choose, and repeat. Freud's insight goes beyond the individual. It also applies to culture, collective repressions, social taboos, and moral ideals, when pushed down, eventually return as cultural symptoms. Wars, fanaticism, repeated violence. Psychoanalysis, therefore, isn't just a theory of the individual. It's also a critique of civilization itself. Freud teaches that seeking truth requires more than reason. It demands listening, patience, and courage to face what we avoid. Because truth isn't out there, exposed. It's inside us, hidden, disguised, yet persistent, and sooner or later, it always finds a way to return. Truth doesn't always need to be explained. Sometimes, it simply happens. In Zen, a spiritual tradition born from the meeting of Indian Buddhism and Chinese Taoism, truth isn't found in concepts, words, or theories, but in the direct experience of reality as it is, without filters. This experience is called satori, a moment of sudden awakening, a deep intuition that tears through the veil of illusion. In Zen, the conceptual mind, the one that divides, labels, analyzes, and compares, is seen as an obstacle to real understanding. Not because thinking is useless, but because ultimate truth can't be reduced to dualistic thought, which separates subject and object, right and wrong, self and world. Zen doesn't reject intellect. It simply reminds us that thinking isn't the only way of knowing. Sometimes, thinking too much is exactly what blinds us. Satori can happen in an instant. It doesn't require years of theoretical study or a rigid belief system. It can arise in the sound of rain, in sweeping the floor, in looking at a stone, or washing a bowl. The moment the mind becomes still and the ego lets go, reality reveals itself, simple, intense, absolute in its impermanence. That's why Zen masters often teach through gestures, paradoxes, or seemingly absurd stories. A student asks, "What is Zen?" The master replies, 3 pounds of flax. Another asks, what is the meaning of life? And receives only a slap or the sound of a bell. These aren't jokes. They're ways of breaking habitual thinking and pointing directly to what can't be said. Zen isn't a doctrine to believe in, but a practice to live. Sitting in silence, breathing, observing thoughts without clinging to them, acting with full awareness in every movement. All of this is the Zen path. It invites us to be fully present in the now without searching for explanations or escaping reality. Because truth is always here, but we are rarely here enough to see it. Satori, though sudden, isn't a random miracle. It's the result of cultivated attention, of an open and quiet mind, of a willingness to unlearn. It's not about reaching a permanent state of enlightenment, but about glimpsing, even for a second, the unity of all things. As the Zen master Dogen once said, studying the way is studying the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. Forgetting the self is being enlightened by all things. In Zen, truth can't be taught. It's transmitted. It can't be spoken, only pointed to. It can't be proven, only lived. And when it reveals itself, even for an instant, everything changes. Because we finally see the world not as we think it is, but as it truly is. We live in an age where truth has lost its prestige. It's no longer enough for a statement to be supported by facts or evidence. What really matters now is whether it feels true, whether it comforts us, whether it confirms what we already believe. This is the essence of the post-truth era, a time when truth stops being a commitment to facts and becomes an emotional, political, and technological construction. The term post-truth doesn't mean that truth has disappeared. It means that it's no longer at the center of public life. Instead of seeking what's closest to reality, we often choose what reinforces our beliefs, what fits into our ideological bubbles, what makes us feel like we belong. In this context, truth becomes a convenient fiction, not necessarily because it's false, but because it's carefully shaped to please. The rise of post-truth is deeply tied to the information age, with social media, algorithmic personalization, and an overwhelming flood of content. Access to information has never been easier, and yet trust in truth has never been weaker. That's because algorithms don't show us what's true. They show us what's most compatible with our habits, emotions, and biases. This creates digital bubbles, personalized spaces where everything we see confirms what we already think. In this environment, fake news doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be believable enough to trigger anger, fear, or identification. Once those emotions take over, critical thinking gives way to reaction. Truth stops being a rational effort and becomes an emotional narrative. From a philosophical perspective, this marks a break from the classical idea of truth as correspondence with facts, as Aristotle saw it, or the modern notion of truth as rational certainty, as Descartes proposed. In the post-truth era, facts become secondary, and truth is measured by impact, by how strongly it moves people, not by how closely it reflects reality. This crisis has deep ethical and political consequences. When truth is treated as something relative, it becomes easy to justify any discourse, manipulate information, rewrite history, or deny scientific evidence. The problem isn't just lying, it's the growing indifference toward lies. But the philosophy of post-truth also acts as a mirror. It shows that the real issue might not be the absence of truth, but our increasing inability to deal with its complexity. In a world that's fast, polarized, and emotional, truth requires time, listening, nuance, and responsibility, qualities that are becoming rare. The way forward isn't to return to a naive idea of absolute truth, but to rebuild a culture of dialogue, critical listening, and rational empathy. Philosophy's role here isn't to impose certainties, but to create spaces for clarity, because even in the age of post-truth, the honest search for truth remains an act of resistance. David Hume's philosophy forces us to face a deeply unsettling idea. What we call truth about the world might just be a psychological habit, not a rational certainty. He didn't deny that we learn through experience. In fact, he was one of the leading figures of empiricism. But he showed that there are strict limits to what we can truly know for sure. For Hume, the human mind doesn't operate based on absolute truths, but on associations of ideas formed by repetition. When we see the sun rise every day, we naturally expect it to rise again tomorrow. But that's not a necessary truth, like 2 + 2 = 4. It's a belief built through habit. The problem is that we tend to treat these expectations as if they were certainties. This critique strikes directly at one of the pillars of human knowledge, the notion of causality. According to Hume, we never actually see cause itself. We only see one event following another. When one billiard ball hits another and sets it in motion, we assume the first caused the movement of the second. But that connection isn't something we can observe. It's our mind that imposes it, based on repetition. As he wrote, we can never discover a necessary connection between cause and effect through reason alone. With that, Hume delivered a powerful challenge to the validity of inductive reasoning, the method we use to infer general laws from specific observations. Science, for instance, relies on induction. We observe many cases and formulate laws. But according to Hume, there's no logical guarantee that the future will resemble the past. Our trust in the regularity of the world is an act of faith in habit, not a rational deduction. That doesn't mean he rejected empirical knowledge. In fact, he was simply realistic about human limits. For him, experience is all we have, but we must understand its boundaries. Philosophy, therefore, shouldn't promise absolute truths, but help us grasp how and why we believe what we believe. Hume also distinguished between two kinds of truths: relations of ideas, like those in math and logic, necessary, but they don't tell us anything about the real world. Matters of fact, which depend on experience but can never be known with absolute certainty. This distinction laid the foundation for modern critiques of reason, most famously influencing Immanuel Kant, who said Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. Hume's impact was so profound that it forced philosophy to rethink the very nature of knowledge, truth, and reason itself. At its core, Hume's message is one of humility. He reminds us that the human mind has limits, and much of what we take as truth is simply well-established belief reinforced by repetition. That doesn't mean we can't act or think. It just means we should do so with awareness of how fragile the ground beneath us really is. And maybe it's exactly that awareness that allows us to seek truth with more clarity and a little less arrogance. Amid all the complexity of language and philosophical debates about what is or isn't true, Alfred Tarski, a 20th century Polish logician and mathematician, offered a solution that was deceptively simple. For him, truth could be formalized, expressed in precise, unambiguous terms. His now famous definition states, "Snow is white is true if, and only if, snow is white." As obvious as that might sound, it represents a major technical breakthrough in logic and semantics. Tarski wasn't just repeating Aristotle's idea of truth as correspondence between language and reality. He was creating a formal way to define what it means to call something true within a system of language. His theory, known as the semantic theory of truth, begins with the idea that propositions, statements that can be true or false, must be evaluated against a model of the world, a structure in which the terms of the statement have clear meanings. The sentence, "Snow is white," belongs to what Tarski called the object language, while the statement that this sentence is true belongs to a metalanguage, a language used to talk about another language. This distinction between object language and metalanguage was key to avoiding old logical paradoxes, such as the liar's paradox, "This sentence is false." By keeping the levels of language separate, Tarski was able to build a coherent and rigorous definition of truth inside formal systems. For Tarski, an adequate definition of truth must satisfy what he called the T schema. P is true if and only if P. Applying it, the Earth orbits the Sun is true if and only if the Earth orbits the Sun. It may sound tautological, but that's exactly its strength. It makes truth transparent. It shows that truth is a property of sentences, dependent on whether what's said matches the actual state of the world within a clearly defined model. Tarski's theory went far beyond philosophy of language. It became a cornerstone of modern logic, model theory, and computer science. When we design formal languages, like those used in programming or artificial intelligence, we need a way to evaluate whether commands, rules, or statements are true or false. Much of that foundation comes directly from Tarski's work. Unlike philosophers who explored truth in existential, ethical, or spiritual terms, Tarski offered a structural, functional, and technical definition. He didn't ask, what is truth in itself? But rather, how can we define truth in a way that's logically valid within a system? That objectivity doesn't make his proposal any less profound. On the contrary, it highlights a side of truth that's crucial in an age of algorithms, data, and artificial languages: the need for precision, consistency, and clarity. In the world of formal language, truth is what remains firm when the meaning of words aligns with the model of the world, without confusion, without ambiguity, and with absolute rigor. At the heart of India's spiritual and philosophical tradition lies a vision of truth that isn't about logic or perception, but about the deep realization of one's own essence. Vedanta, one of the highest schools of Hindu philosophy, teaches that the supreme truth is Brahman, the absolute, eternal, infinite, and unified reality. Everything we see as separate, limited, or impermanent is Maya, illusion, born from avidya, ignorance of our true nature. For Vedanta, Brahman is beyond time, space, and causality. It's not a personal being with desires or intentions, like the gods in theistic religions. It is the very substance of existence, that which makes everything be, that which permeates all things without form or attributes, yet being everything. Brahman is pure being, pure consciousness, the ultimate reality. The root of human suffering, according to this view, lies in ignorance of who we really are. We believe ourselves to be separate bodies, isolated minds, egos in conflict with the world. We identify with names, roles, thoughts, and desires, forgetting that, at the deepest level, we are one with the whole. This ignorance, avidya, gives rise to illusion, pain, and duality. The path of Vedanta isn't about collecting intellectual knowledge, but awakening to the truth that's already within us. This awakening is expressed in one of the most famous phrases from the Upanishads, the sacred philosophical texts of Hinduism. Tat tvam asi. You are that. That is Brahman. You, the individual, are the same as the whole. Not in appearance, but in essence. Realizing this truth means breaking the veil of illusion and reaching spiritual liberation, known as moksha. Truth, then, isn't something we learn. It's something we recognize. Like waking from a dream and realizing we were free all along. Vedanta teaches that liberation isn't achieved but revealed, because what we truly are is already infinite. We simply have to remember. This journey requires practice, reflection, meditation, and silence. The ego must give way, the mind must become still. As the layers of false identity dissolve, consciousness recognizes itself as Brahman, without division, without boundaries, without fear. Unlike nihilism, Vedanta doesn't deny reality. It transcends it without rejecting it. It says, everything is Brahman. The world, the body, the thoughts, everything. The difference lies in perception. To see the world as separate is illusion. To see it as a manifestation of the One is wisdom. In Vedanta, truth can't truly be spoken. It can only be lived as a direct experience of being. And when that happens, all conflict fades, fear disappears, the ego dissolves, and what remains is the peace of knowing, I am that. In the 17th century, during the rise of the natural sciences and the decline of traditional authorities, John Locke made a decisive shift in the history of philosophy by claiming that all human knowledge comes from sensory experience. Rejecting the innate ideas defended by rationalist philosophers like Descartes, Locke famously said, "The mind is like a blank slate." In other words, we are born without built-in truths or pre-written ideas. Everything we know is formed gradually through experience. For Locke, there are no universal truths imprinted on the soul. What exists is a receptive mind that is shaped as the senses take in the external world. Through sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, we gather information, and from those experiences, we form ideas. Truth, in this sense, isn't something discovered through pure rational introspection, but something that can be verified through observation and experiment. This focus on experience led Locke to develop an empiricist theory of knowledge. He distinguished between two kinds of ideas: simple ideas, which come directly from sensation, like color, shape, or sound; complex ideas, which are formed by the mind's activity, combining and reflecting on simple ideas. Thus, the mind isn't passive. It works with the material provided by the senses, building more complex concepts such as justice, freedom, identity, and truth. This view deeply transformed how knowledge was understood in the modern era. For Locke, truth is a correspondence between our ideas and the facts we can verify through experience. If a statement is true, it must be testable based on empirical evidence, not by pure deduction or appeals to authority. This way of thinking had a huge impact on modern science. The experimental method championed by Newton, Bacon, and Galileo finds strong philosophical support in Locke's ideas. Reliable knowledge is built on repeated experience, careful observation, and the removal of bias. But Locke's influence went far beyond epistemology. He extended his empiricism to politics, education, and ethics. If we are born without innate ideas, then no one is born with natural authority over another. All people are equal in rights, and legitimate government must come from the consent of the governed, not divine inheritance. This principle directly shaped the Enlightenment and the rise of modern democracies. Locke's notion of truth is simple but powerful. Truth is what can be verified through shared, common experience. No dogmas, private revelations, or baseless speculation. Sensory experience is the courtroom where all ideas must be tested. In a world filled with conflicting information and beliefs, Locke invites us to return to the basics, to trust what can be seen, tested, and confirmed. Because as he taught, the mind doesn't come with truths built in, it learns from the world. And through that ongoing learning, truth gradually reveals itself. In the first half of the 20th century, a revolutionary movement took over psychology: behaviorism. Its proposal was bold and radical: to abandon the study of the mind's internal contents, thoughts, emotions, intentions, and focus only on what can be observed, measured, and objectively tested: behavior. For behaviorists, psychology needed to become as rigorous as physics. To do that, it had to leave behind anything subjective, anything that couldn't be publicly verified. The study of the mind was replaced by the study of patterns between stimulus and response. The mind, a black box whose inner workings didn't matter. What mattered was what goes in, stimulus, what comes out, response, and how those patterns can be predicted, controlled, and modified. John B. Watson, considered the father of behaviorism, summarized it clearly: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, or thief." That statement captures one of behaviorism's core ideas. The human being is shaped by the environment. There's no fixed essence, no immutable soul. Behavior is learned through conditioning. This is what Watson, and later B.F. Skinner, developed as classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Skinner took behaviorism even further. For him, absolutely everything in human behavior could be explained through positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and the absence of stimuli. When a behavior is followed by a satisfying consequence, it tends to repeat. When it's punished, it tends to fade. So, the truth about human behavior could be fully explained through observable and testable laws. This had enormous practical impact. Behaviorism inspired behavior modification techniques, behavioral therapy, reinforcement-based education, and animal training. In this view, psychological truth wasn't something internal. It was something external, verifiable by any neutral observer. This approach was also a direct rejection of earlier schools of psychology, like introspectionism, which relied on subjective reports from patients. To the behaviorists, that wasn't scientific. It was unreliable. Truth, they argued, had to be public, measurable, and based on empirical evidence. Over time, however, behaviorism was criticized for being too reductionist. Completely ignoring mental states, inner language, emotions, and subjective experience proved insufficient to explain the full complexity of human life. That led to the rise of cognitive psychology, which sought to bring the mind back into the discussion, without sacrificing scientific rigor. Still, behaviorism's contribution remains crucial. It taught us that actions speak as loudly as, or louder than, intentions, and that the truth about human behavior can often be found in the concrete patterns of real life. In other words, for behaviorism, to know the truth is to observe what people do, not just what they say or think. In the tradition of analytic philosophy, truth is treated with almost surgical precision. Far from existential or metaphysical interpretations, this school focuses on the logical analysis of language and the formal criteria that determine whether a statement is true or false. In this view, truth is a semantic property of well-formed statements, a relationship between what is said and the elements of the system in which it's said. Analytic philosophy emerged in the early 20th century, led by thinkers like Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein in his early phase, and later Alfred Tarski and Willard van Orman Quine. Their goal was to bring philosophy closer to the clarity and precision of the exact sciences, treating philosophical problems as, in many cases, errors in language or conceptual confusion. In this context, truth stops being something mysterious or subjective. It becomes a logical value assigned to sentences. For example, when we say, "Snow is white," that statement is true if and only if snow is, in fact, white in the world we're referring to. This is the semantic correspondence model, formalized by Tarski in his theory of truth for formal languages. But for analytic philosophers, the key isn't just the correspondence with facts in the world. It's also the internal structure of the statement itself. It must be well-formed, with clear syntactic rules and well-defined terms. Otherwise, it can't even have a truth value. For instance, the sentence "colorful sleeps quickly" may be grammatically correct, but it lacks logical meaning. It can't be true or false because it says nothing that can be verified. For analytic philosophy, then, truth is tied to how language functions and how it's used in specific contexts. This also involves a strong concern with ambiguity, vagueness, and multiple meanings, common obstacles to both philosophical analysis and clear communication. By studying language with such care, analytic philosophers made major contributions to fields like formal logic, theory of reference, semantics, philosophy of mind, computer science, and even artificial intelligence. The conceptual clarity and logical discipline introduced by this movement made it possible to design systems that operate with symbolic language, the foundation of today's algorithms and databases. However, analytic philosophers also came to recognize that language isn't just a formal structure. Over time, internal critics like Quine and Wittgenstein, in his later work, pointed out the limits of pure formalism and emphasized the importance of how language is used in everyday life. Still, the legacy remains. In analytic philosophy, truth is something determined within a logical linguistic system. It depends on precision, form, and meaning. There's no room for ambiguity or vague metaphors, only for what can be clearly expressed. As Wittgenstein famously wrote in the Tractatus, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." For Zhuangzi, truth isn't a fixed structure or an absolute destination. It's movement, constant change, and transformation. Reality is multiple and ever-shifting, and any attempt to trap it in rigid concepts is, to him, just an illusion created by the human mind. Zhuangzi, or Chuangzi, a Taoist thinker from the 4th century BCE, is known for his provocative teachings, poetic allegories, and a playful sense of humor that dismantles certainty. Unlike systems that try to define ultimate truths, he invites us to loosen our mental rigidity and accept uncertainty as the natural condition of existence. One of his most famous stories is the dream of the butterfly. "Once, I dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering around happily, not knowing I was Zhuangzi. When I woke up, I didn't know if I was Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that I was Zhuangzi." This simple tale carries a deep question. Where lies the truth of identity, perception, and reality? How can we be sure we're awake? Or that what we call real is any truer than what we experience in dreams? Zhuangzi doesn't offer a final answer. Instead, he proposes a change in attitude. Rather than searching for one absolute truth, we should embrace the plurality of perspectives. What's true from one point of view might not be from another. What's real to a fish swimming in the river might be incomprehensible to a person standing on the shore. He also tells another story. A man and his friend watch fish swimming joyfully. One says, "Look how happy the fish are." The other replies, "You're not a fish. How do you know they're happy?" The first responds, "You're not me. How do you know that I don't know?" This dialogue captures the core of Zhuangzi's thought. Absolute knowledge about others, or even about ourselves, is always limited. Every certainty depends on perspective, and perspective itself is fluid. In Zhuangzi's view, language is a trap. By naming things, we freeze them. But the world is never still. Life is a continuous flow, and our mental categories in trying to control it pull us away from true harmony with the Tao, the fundamental principle that underlies all things. Wisdom, then, doesn't lie in defining what's true, but in learning to move through impermanence with grace and detachment. The wise person doesn't cling to absolute judgments, but flows with uncertainty, adapting like water, which takes the shape of whatever contains it. For Zhuangzi, truth isn't something to be reached, it's something to be lived. To live truthfully is to accept that there's no fixed center, no unchanging self, and no single reality. Everything changes, everything transforms. Truth is, above all, relational and temporary. In a world obsessed with certainty, Zhuangzi teaches us to trust the flow, to laugh at rigidity, and to remember that perhaps the only lasting truth is this: everything passes, even truths themselves. In existential philosophy, truth isn't a mathematical formula or an objective match between thought and reality. For thinkers like Kierkegaard, Sartre, and Camus, the deepest truth is something you live, not something you think or prove. It shows itself in how a person embraces their own existence with courage, freedom, and responsibility. This idea begins with a simple but unsettling realization. The human being is alone in the world, thrown into an existence with no ready-made meaning. There are no manuals, no guarantees, no absolute truths telling us who we are or what we should be. The only certainty we have is our own freedom, and with it, the anxiety of having to choose our own path. For Søren Kierkegaard, often called the father of existentialism, truth is subjective. But that doesn't mean it's arbitrary or purely emotional. It means that the most essential truth for a human being is the one they live with passion and commitment, even in the face of doubt. His classic example is faith. It can't be proven rationally, yet for Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is an act of existential truth because it involves the whole person, body, mind, and soul. For Jean-Paul Sartre, human existence is defined by radical freedom. Man is condemned to be free, he said. That means there is no preset human nature. We are what we make of ourselves. Truth, then, lies in living authentically, accepting that we are responsible for our choices without hiding behind excuses, conventions, or social roles. But freedom comes with a burden, anguish, because every time we choose one path, we're also saying it has value, not just for ourselves, but in some sense for everyone. That's why many people run from this responsibility and fall into what Sartre called bad faith. The lie we tell ourselves to avoid facing our freedom and the truth of our existence. Albert Camus, on the other hand, spoke of the absurd, the tension between our need for meaning and a universe that gives us none. The world offers no clear answers, and that can feel tragic. But Camus saw this as an opportunity, the chance to create meaning through our own experience. Truth, in this sense, means accepting the absurd without denying life, living with intensity, defiance, and clarity. As he writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, the important thing is to imagine Sisyphus happy. Even as he pushes the rock uphill, he is free. In existentialism, truth isn't something you find out there. It's built through the way you choose to exist. To be true isn't to repeat doctrines, but to face your own freedom honestly, without masks, without self-deception. So existential philosophy leaves us with one simple but radical question. Are you living a life that's truly yours, or just following a script someone else wrote for you? Because in the end, being true means being whole, even in the face of the absurd, under the weight of freedom, in the silence of the world. We live with the feeling that we perceive the world as it really is. We believe our eyes see reality, that our memory faithfully stores facts, and that our mind can clearly tell truth from falsehood. But modern neuroscience has revealed something surprising, even unsettling. What we call truth is often just a simulation created by the brain. Instead of being a mirror of the world, the brain acts as an active interpreter. It selects, organizes, and reconstructs sensory information based on past experiences, expectations, and survival needs. We don't see the world as it is. We see it as our brain makes it understandable. This construction of reality is both brilliant and deceptive. One clear example is the phenomenon of false memory, when the brain creates memories of events that never happened. A person may swear they lived through an experience, recall details, even feel emotions tied to it, yet the facts never occurred. This shows something essential. The mind seeks coherence, not factual precision. Why does this happen? Because the brain is constantly trying to predict what comes next. According to advanced theories in cognitive neuroscience, like the predictive brain model, the mind doesn't just react to the world, it anticipates it, filling in gaps, correcting noise, and creating connections. In a sense, perception is a controlled hallucination. This applies not only to sight and memory, but also to truth itself. What we consider real is whatever fits within the internal narrative our brain constructs. When something contradicts that narrative, it's easier for the brain to distort it than to rebuild the whole model. That's why false beliefs can persist, even when confronted with clear evidence. Neuroscience, therefore, directly challenges the idea that truth simply exists waiting to be perceived. Instead, it suggests that truth is an ongoing process of interpretation, biologically shaped and culturally influenced. And while this kind of truth is functional, it helps us act, decide, and survive. It isn't necessarily objective. In a way, neuroscience brings science closer to ancient philosophical insights. For example, Kant once said that we don't know the world in itself, only the phenomena filtered through our cognitive structures. Now, neuroscience provides empirical evidence for that same conclusion. But does this mean everything is an illusion? Not exactly. The brain seeks consistency, and within that consistency, there are degrees of truth. The key is recognizing that perception is a hypothesis, one constantly being tested and revised. From a neuroscientific point of view, truth is always provisional, contextual, and dependent on how our neural system is working. And in an age of misinformation and polarization, this idea comes with a warning. The human mind is an excellent storyteller, but not always a faithful one. Seeking truth, then, requires more than trusting our perception. It means questioning the very structure that shapes our experience. For the Stoics, truth isn't an abstract idea to be contemplated, it's a way of living. Truth doesn't show itself in speeches or theories, but in how we live our lives with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. In other words, truth is practical. It means living in harmony with the rational nature that defines us. Founded by Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BCE and later developed by Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosophy begins with the idea that the universe is ruled by a cosmic reason called the Logos. This reason exists in everything, including us. Therefore, to live truthfully is to live in harmony with this universal reason. But what does that mean in practice? It means that human beings, endowed with reason, should not be ruled by uncontrolled passions, nor get lost in desires, fears, or shifting opinions. The truth of human nature is to be rational, and to act rationally, even in the face of pain, loss, injustice, or failure. For the Stoics, suffering comes from valuing things that don't depend on us, other people's opinions, luck, the body, wealth, or external success. When we base our happiness on those things, we become fragile and miserable. Inner truth reveals itself only when we focus on what is under our control, our actions, our choices, and our attitude toward life. Epictetus said, "It's not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we have about them." That line captures the essence of Stoic thought. Truth doesn't lie in appearances, but in how we interpret and respond to them. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor philosopher, wrote in his Meditations, "Happiness is found in acting according to human nature, that is, with reason and virtue." Seneca reinforced this with a moral view of truth. To be true is to be integral, to live consistently with one's principles, without hypocrisy or self-deception. He saw the wise person as someone who, even surrounded by the world's chaos, remains calm and steady. Not out of apathy, but from inner clarity. Stoic philosophy is, above all, a call to ethical authenticity. It's not enough to know what's right. You have to practice it, every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Truth is revealed in character, not in words. And this vision feels incredibly relevant today. In an age full of distractions, anxiety, and the constant search for external validation, the Stoics remind us that peace doesn't come from the outside. It comes from inner coherence. Truth means living with purpose, aligned with our rational and virtuous nature. So, for a Stoic, to be true is to have the courage to live as if every choice shows who you really are. Because in the end, truth isn't what you say, it's what you live. For Epicurus, the truth about life isn't found in complex metaphysical theories or promises of heavenly rewards, but in what is directly lived and felt by human beings, pleasure and pain. However, contrary to what many people think, Epicurus didn't promote a life of excess. His teaching was far more subtle and profound. True happiness lies in seeking stable, simple, and lasting pleasures, and most importantly, in the absence of pain. This idea is based on a key principle. Human nature naturally guides us toward pleasure and away from pain. For Epicurus, that isn't a flaw. It's a reliable guide to understanding what is good. Ethical truth isn't imposed from the outside by dogma or divine law. It's revealed through the direct experience of peace and well-being. But what kind of pleasure did Epicurus actually value? Not intense, chaotic, short-lived pleasures that leave us anxious or empty afterward. Instead, he spoke of calm pleasures, ataraxia, the peace of the soul, and aponia, the absence of physical pain. This tranquility can only be reached when we free ourselves from unnecessary fears and empty desires. In that sense, knowledge plays a crucial role. Epicurus believed philosophy was a kind of therapy, whose main purpose was to free people from mental suffering. He famously said, "Vain is the word of a philosopher that heals no human pain." According to him, two main fears keep us from serenity: the fear of the gods and the fear of death. The first comes from the belief that the gods care about our actions and might punish us. But Epicurus, influenced by Democritus's atomism, taught that if the gods exist, they live in perfect happiness and indifference. They don't interfere in human life. The second fear, death, runs even deeper. But for Epicurus, it's based on a logical mistake. Death is nothing to us, he said, because as long as we exist, death isn't here. And when death comes, we no longer exist. The fear of death comes from confusion, treating the end of consciousness as if it were a painful experience. But there can be no pain where there is no one to feel it. For Epicurus, truth is liberating. When we understand the nature of things, the limits of our desires, the simplicity of true pleasures, and the absence of divine punishment, we can live calmly, among friends, with moderation, wisdom, and gratitude for existence itself. Far from being the shallow hedonist people sometimes imagine, Epicurus was one of the deepest thinkers about pleasure, because he understood that the greatest pleasure is not suffering, and that may be the most forgotten truth of modern life. Happiness lives in simple things: a healthy body, a peaceful mind, and a heart free from fear. What if everything we call truth is, deep down, uncertain? What if no belief, no matter how solid it seems, can ever be guaranteed as absolutely true? That's exactly the kind of question ancient skepticism faced head-on, not with despair, but with calmness. For the ancient skeptics, especially Pyrrho of Elis and Sextus Empiricus, truth, if it exists, lies beyond our reach. But skepticism isn't about rejecting thought. On the contrary, it's a disciplined practice of continuous investigation, one that examines every idea, belief, and theory without clinging to any of them. Its central method is called epoche, or the suspension of judgment. When faced with any question, the skeptic weighs arguments for and against, and upon realizing that both sides have weaknesses and can't be proven conclusively, chooses not to affirm anything with certainty. Pyrrho, who lived in the 4th century BCE, traveled with Alexander the Great on his Eastern campaigns and came into contact with Eastern philosophies, something that deeply shaped his thinking. He noticed that people from different cultures held completely opposite beliefs, each convinced they alone possessed the truth. From this, Pyrrho concluded that maybe none of them had access to real knowledge. For him, we can't fully trust either our senses or our reason. Both have deceived us countless times. And if the very tools we use to seek truth are unreliable, how could we ever claim to know anything for certain? The answer is simple: we can't. Centuries later, Sextus Empiricus systematized this way of thinking in works like Outlines of Pyrrhonism, where he presented the so-called tropes of skepticism, arguments showing how every belief can be challenged. His conclusion? Instead of chasing an unreachable truth, the wisest thing is to refrain from making final judgments, and by doing so, achieve ataraxia, the tranquility of the soul. That's the heart of skeptical philosophy. It doesn't seek certainty, but peace. Human anxiety doesn't come from ignorance, but from the illusion of knowing what's beyond our grasp. By freeing themselves from the obsession with certainty, skeptics found a rare kind of inner freedom, a way to exist in the world without the weight of defending absolute truths. It's important to note that skeptics didn't deny that truth might exist. They simply claimed that we have no reliable way to know what it is. So they lived guided by appearances, customs, and probabilities, but without dogmatic attachment. In today's polarized world, where everyone seems desperate to be right, ancient skepticism feels like a much-needed antidote. It teaches intellectual tolerance, humility before knowledge, and a kind of lightness in the face of doubt. Maybe the greatest piece of skeptical wisdom is this: not knowing is less dangerous than thinking you know. And in suspending judgment, we may discover something paradoxical, that the absence of certainty can be the most peaceful way to live. In the pragmatist tradition, truth isn't a perfect snapshot of reality or an eternal, unchanging structure. For thinkers like William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and John Dewey, truth is, above all, a tool, something that serves human life. Its value lies in how effective it is, in the practical results it brings, not in some abstract correspondence with a world as it is. William James, one of the main figures of American pragmatism, summed it up simply: truth is what works in our thinking. In other words, a belief is true when it works in experience, when it helps us make sense of things, solve real problems, and improve our ability to deal with the world. This doesn't mean that any comforting belief counts as true. On the contrary, pragmatism demands that ideas be tested in real life, that they prove resilient over time in different contexts and bring actual benefits, emotional, social, or intellectual. Truth here isn't static. It's a dynamic process, a working hypothesis that can always be revised based on the results it produces. Imagine someone who believes that people are basically good. That belief can't be proven absolutely, but if it leads to kindness, better relationships, and stronger communities, then it's true to the extent that it works. But if the same belief leads someone into constant disappointment or harm, its practical truth, its usefulness, needs to be questioned. This idea of truth as an instrumental value connects pragmatism closely to science, especially the scientific idea of provisional hypotheses. Science doesn't look for eternal truths, but for useful models that explain and predict phenomena. When a model stops working, it's replaced. For pragmatists, all human knowledge works this way, as a network of beliefs in constant revision. Pragmatism also stands out for its anti-dogmatic and pluralistic spirit. It doesn't look for a single ultimate foundation. It accepts that multiple truths can exist as long as they're useful, coherent, and productive. This isn't the same as pure relativism. It's a commitment to the practical value of ideas. William James even applied this view to religion. For him, a religious belief can be considered true if it positively transforms the believer's life, if it brings peace of mind, moral growth, or a deeper sense of meaning. The question isn't whether God's existence can be proven, but whether belief in God works in human life. Pragmatist philosophy invites us to shift the question. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" we should ask, "Does this idea work? Does it improve life? Does it lead to growth?" In this sense, truth stops being a mirror and becomes a living tool, something organic and action-oriented. It's what helps us navigate the world with more wisdom, freedom, and effectiveness. Because in the end, as William James said, truth is what leads us forward. We live in an age where decisions are made by machines that don't actually understand the world, but detect patterns with uncanny precision. In the logic of artificial intelligence, AI, especially in machine learning and neural networks, truth isn't absolute or conceptual. It's statistical. It doesn't emerge from certainty, but from probability, calculated across massive amounts of data. Unlike philosophical traditions that sought universal foundations or moral truths, AI learns from what has already happened. It doesn't know what is, only what tends to be. When a recommendation algorithm suggests a video, a product, or an answer, it isn't claiming that it's correct or true. It's simply calculating the likelihood that this is relevant based on past data. In that sense, truth becomes closer to plausibility. What's most likely to happen, given a set of variables? The algorithm doesn't aim to understand the world, it aims to predict human behavior. It's often right, without knowing why, like a statistical oracle that looks only to the past to guess the future. This approach has brought undeniable gains in efficiency, but raises deep philosophical questions. When we allow AI to decide what's relevant, useful, or even true, we risk confusing prediction with wisdom and repetition with reality. Take, for example, AI systems used in medical diagnoses, judicial analysis, or credit scoring. These algorithms find correlations among variables, age, history, location, past behavior, and predict outcomes. But correlation isn't causation. What seems statistically likely isn't always ethically acceptable or philosophically sound. And algorithms inherit the biases found in their data. If the past was unjust, unequal, or discriminatory, the system learns that truth and reproduces it, amplifying patterns without self-awareness. As data scientist Cathy O'Neil famously put it, algorithms are opinions embedded in code. Another challenge is the black box problem. The more complex and accurate AI models become, the harder they are to explain. We often don't really know how an algorithm reached a conclusion. Truth then becomes a statistical black box. We trust the results without understanding the reasoning, which deeply challenges traditional ideas of rationality and transparency. At its core, the AI paradigm forces us to rethink what we mean by knowledge itself. Truth stops being something contemplated, demonstrated, or experienced, and becomes something modeled mathematically, with error margins and constant recalibration. It's no longer what is, but what works well enough most of the time. And maybe that's the biggest philosophical question AI poses. When truth becomes statistics, what happens to wisdom? For Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, truth isn't something isolated, frozen in a single moment, or contained within one statement. It's movement, a living totality that reveals itself through the contradictions of thought, history, and reality. His famous statement captures it perfectly. The true is the whole. But what does it mean to say that truth lies in the whole? For Hegel, it means that no part of reality or of knowledge can be considered true by itself when separated from its context, its process, and its internal oppositions. Truth, therefore, is processual. It unfolds through what he called dialectics. In its most familiar form, the dialectical process moves through three stages: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis asserts something. The antithesis denies or contradicts it. The synthesis overcomes that opposition, not by erasing it, but by integrating it into a higher level of understanding. That synthesis then becomes a new thesis, generating a new contradiction, and so the process continues. This isn't just a logical or abstract idea. For Hegel, it's the very movement of reality, of spirit, and of history. Reason doesn't stand outside the world observing it. Reason lives within history and develops along with it. Truth, then, isn't a fixed point, but a process of reason becoming aware of itself, moving toward freedom. In his monumental work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the journey of human consciousness from sensory experience to absolute knowledge. Each stage of this journey contains its own partiality, its own limits, and therefore its own contradiction, which pushes consciousness forward. We learn through our errors. We grow by confronting ourselves. Through conflict, the mind becomes more complex and more free. This also applies to human history. Hegel saw history as a rational process. Even if it appears chaotic, revolutions, wars, social collapses, all are expressions of internal tensions that must be resolved. For him, history is the stage where freedom gradually realizes itself and where truth reveals itself through struggle, conflict, and reconciliation. This vision carries deep implications. Unlike static or essentialist views of truth, Hegel saw contradiction not as a flaw, but as the driving force of progress. Truth doesn't avoid opposition, it embraces it and transforms it. That's why, for Hegel, fragmented thinking fails to grasp reality. Dividing subject from object, individual from society, reason from emotion, all of these are abstractions that cut up the living whole of experience. Only by thinking the whole, dynamic, contradictory, and constantly changing can we approach truth? In the end, Hegel challenges us to see reality not as something given, but as something that becomes a process where each partial moment only gains meaning when seen as part of the unfolding whole. Because for him, truth isn't what simply is, it's what becomes. For Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the great thinkers of modern rationalism, truth isn't something uniform. It varies according to the logical nature of the statement being made, and that's what makes his thoughts so subtle and powerful. Leibniz invites us to distinguish between two fundamental kinds of truth: truths of reason and truths of fact. Truths of reason are those that are necessarily true. They can be known purely through reason without relying on experience. They are universal, eternal, and self-evident when properly understood. For example, 2 plus 2, 4, or a triangle has 3 sides. To deny these statements isn't just wrong, it's contradictory. They are true in all possible worlds. Leibniz argued that in truths of reason, the predicate is already contained in the subject. For example, in the statement, "A bachelor is unmarried," the definition of bachelor already includes unmarried. These statements are analytical, and their truth follows from the logical structure of concepts themselves. Truths of fact, on the other hand, are contingent. They depend on experience, on the real world, on empirical observation. A classic example is, "The Earth orbits the Sun." That statement is true, but it could have been otherwise. In another universe, with different physical laws, perhaps the Sun would orbit the Earth. So, it's not logically necessary. It depends on how things actually are. This distinction between the two kinds of truth has massive implications for philosophy, science, and even theology. Leibniz saw truths of reason as the foundation of the formal sciences, like mathematics and logic. Truths of fact, on the other hand, belong to the realm of the natural sciences, the study of what happens in the world and why. But how can we trust that the world is ordered if truths of fact are contingent? Here enters one of Leibniz's central ideas, the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing happens without a sufficient reason for being the way it is, and not otherwise. Even the most contingent facts have an explanation, even if we can't always access it. For Leibniz, that ultimate reason is God, the supreme being who chose, among all possible worlds, the best one to exist. This view expresses Leibniz's characteristic rational optimism. If reason structures the world, then even apparent randomness has a logical connection beneath it. Philosophy and science exist to uncover that connection, to understand how truths are distributed and how they interact at different levels. In the end, the distinction Leibniz proposed remains just as relevant today. Not all truths are of the same kind. Some are necessary, others contingent. Some are discovered through thinking, others through experience. Understanding this difference means realizing that truth isn't just one thing. It has many faces, each with its own rules, limits, and ways of being known. For St. Augustine, one of the greatest minds in Christianity and Western philosophy, truth isn't just a logical concept or a reflection of the physical world. It's light, a living presence that shines within the soul. And that light doesn't come from this world. It's the illumination of God, which allows us to know, discern, and recognize what is true. Augustine lived between the 4th and 5th centuries during the transition from the Roman to the Christian world. His search for truth began early and took him through several philosophical schools, including Manichaeism, skepticism, and Neoplatonism, until he found, in the Christian scriptures and in the experience of faith, the deepest answer to his restless soul. One of the most beautiful moments in his thought appears in Confessions, where he writes, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. You were within me, but I was outside, searching for you." Here, Augustine reveals that truth isn't outside, in the ever-changing things of the world, but within the soul, where God dwells. It's this divine presence that enlightens us and makes knowledge possible. His theory of knowledge is based on what he calls divine illumination. Just as the eyes can only see because of physical light, the human mind can only know because it is illuminated by a higher light, the eternal light of truth, which is God. This light doesn't just make things visible, it guarantees that what we know is truly real. Augustine also faced the challenge of skepticism. When confronted with radical doubt, he made an observation that still resonates today. If I am mistaken, I exist. Si falor sum. This statement anticipates Descartes' famous cogito by more than 1,000 years. Even if I doubt everything, the very act of doubting proves that there is an I that doubts. Therefore, the existence of the thinking self is undeniable, a solid starting point for all knowledge. But Augustine goes further. For him, this certainty doesn't come from isolated reasoning, but from God's presence within the soul, the source that guarantees not only our existence, but also the possibility of knowing eternal truths: mathematical, logical, moral, and spiritual. These truths don't change, don't decay, and can't be lost, and they can only come from the divine mind. Thus, for Augustine, truth is participation in the eternal. When we recognize something true, our soul aligns itself with the divine. Reason, therefore, doesn't oppose faith, it's strengthened by it. Faith opens us to the light of truth, and reason helps us recognize it with humility and reverence. In a world full of uncertainty, Augustine invites us to turn inward, to quiet the external noise and listen to the gentle voice of truth within us, not as an opinion, but as light. Because in the end, truth isn't just something to be understood, it's something to be found, and once found, it transforms us. In politics, truth is never neutral. It isn't just an abstract ideal, it's a battlefield of power, control, and manipulation. Throughout history, claims about what's true or false have often been used not to enlighten people, but to control, persuade, and dominate. In this sense, truth becomes an ideological tool, something shaped to serve specific interests, often disguised as universal principles. The quote attributed to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, is a chilling and timeless warning. A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. This logic shows that in the political arena, truth can be manufactured, staged, and imposed by those who control the media, cultural symbols, and institutions that define what is considered acceptable as real. Modern and contemporary political philosophy have tried to expose these mechanisms. Machiavelli, for example, observed that a ruler's image, not their morality, was essential to maintaining power. What mattered wasn't being virtuous, but appearing to be. In that sense, political truth wasn't a moral value in itself, but an effective illusion. In the 20th century, Michel Foucault went even deeper. For him, truth is directly tied to systems of power. What a society accepts as true depends on its institutions, its dominant discourses, and its mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. There is no pure truth outside of history, only regimes of truth, built and maintained by networks of power. In recent years, this has become even more visible. The so-called post-truth era shows that objective facts often lose influence to emotional appeals and identity-driven narratives. Social media, algorithms, and digital echo chambers make it possible to personalize truth, creating parallel realities where beliefs are reinforced and doubt itself is discredited. In this environment, truth stops being a shared value and becomes a territory of ideological conflict. Whoever controls the means of producing truth, media, science, technology, language, also controls public consciousness. Modern social engineering, powered by data, neuromarketing, and psychological manipulation, has intensified this crisis. Political campaigns are increasingly guided by psychometrics, micro-targeting, and fake news, tools capable of steering collective behavior without people even realizing it. In this context, Truth isn't simply hidden, it's custom-made to provoke emotional reactions. That's why the role of political philosophy today is not just to expose manipulation, but to awaken critical awareness. We must ask, who is speaking? For what purpose? In service of which power? And most importantly, which truths are being excluded or silenced? Political truth, therefore, is not given, it's contested. It must be fought for, knowing that there's no absolute neutrality, but also that without a commitment to what's common and shared, politics decays into pure manipulation. In an age where truth has become a form of currency, thinking critically is an act of resistance. We've reached a question that isn't just philosophical, it's existential. Is it possible to live without truth? Or even more deeply, can a human being live only on useful beliefs, comforting illusions, or fragile consensuses, without ever touching what is truly real? This question runs through centuries of philosophy, religion, science, and art. Each era has tried to answer it differently, sometimes with absolute convictions, sometimes with radical doubt. But today, in a world overflowing with information, conflicting realities, and algorithm-shaped perceptions, the question has returned with quiet urgency. On one hand, some argue that we don't need truth to live, only ideas that work. That's the spirit of pragmatism. As William James put it, truth is what works. If a belief brings us peace, direction, or stability, it's true enough. The same logic applies to cultural myths, religious traditions, and political ideologies. They often function more as existential tools than as objective descriptions of reality. This view is echoed by Nietzsche, who said that truth is a necessary illusion. A metaphor we've forgotten is a metaphor. For him, living fully doesn't require absolute truths, but rather the strength to create meaning in a world without guarantees. Humanity, then, doesn't really seek truth. It seeks meaning. But is that enough? We also live in an age where truth seems devalued or manipulated. The so-called post-truth era has turned reality into a contest of narratives. Each group defends its own truth, and every digital bubble creates its own facts. Yet this lack of shared truth hasn't set us free. It has divided us. When everything becomes relative, trust collapses, dialogue becomes impossible, and democracy weakens. At this point, Jürgen Habermas offers an ethical warning. Even if there's no absolute truth we can access, we still need truth as an ideal in order to coexist. The search for truth isn't a luxury, it's a requirement for collective life. Without a shared horizon of meaning, all that remains is cynicism, manipulation, and conflict. And then there's the personal side of it. Can we truly live in peace while holding on to useful illusions, knowing deep down that they're illusions? Humans can adapt to many things, but there's a part of us that resists falsehood, a deep longing for authenticity. As Kierkegaard said, truth is a matter of inner subjectivity. To live truthfully, even amid doubt, is an act of courage. So perhaps the real question isn't whether we can live without truth, but what kind of life that would be. A life based only on what's useful might be functional, but would it be meaningful? A life built on illusions might feel comfortable, but would it be whole? In the end, maybe truth doesn't need to be possessed, only pursued with honesty, humility, and openness. Because living without truth may be possible, but living without seeking it, that might cost us our very humanity. Thank you for watching until the end. If this content made you think, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who also values great ideas. Leave a comment below. Which view about truth impacted you the most? Let's keep this conversation going. Stay around. There's much more philosophy, critical thinking, and deep reflections coming in the next videos. See you next time, and never stop seeking.